Well, if you listened carefully to what Paul Krugman said, he actually agreed with me. Because what he said was that everything was just fine as long as the financial credibility of the United States wasn't called into question. But my point is that it will be called into question, Paul. Of course it will. Even if the administration's crazily optimistic forecasts for growth turn out to be right, yes, it's going to be a 3% growth rate next year, 4% the year after that, 4.6% the year after that. If you believe those numbers, you'll believe absolutely anything. But they are there in the administration's budget document. Even if those numbers turn out to be true, the gross federal debt will rise over the next 5 to 10 years to around 100% of gross domestic product. But since those numbers are clearly wrong, and the trend growth rate of the US will be much closer to 1% than to 4%, it seems reasonable to anticipate a much more rapid explosion of federal debt to somewhere in the region of 140 or 150% of gross domestic product. Now, Paul tried to reassure you that the rising savings rate would absorb easily all of this additional debt. But I have to point out that what he said was misleading. Even if the private savings rate rebounded to its highest point in the post-war period, it would still account for no more than 5% of gross domestic product. But this year's deficit, as I said earlier, is likely to be north of 12% of gross domestic product. So, I hate to teach arithmetic to a Nobel laureate, it doesn't quite add up. The Fed has committed itself to buying $300 billion worth of treasuries this year, but clearly it will have to buy a great many more than that. Remember, 1.7 or so trillion dollars are coming onto the market. And you just assume that the credibility of the United States in the eyes of Americans as well as foreign investors is going to withstand this? At some point, you know, the United States does start to look like a Latin American economy, not only to people abroad, but maybe people at home. If the Fed's balance sheet explodes to up to $3 or $4 trillion, who knows how big it could get? At what point do people stop believing in the United States dollar as a reserve currency, or even as a store of value for their own savings? And these are the points which it seems to me the economists who are in a majority on this panel are dodging. There's a fundamental problem here, which could be addressed if there were any commitment on the part of this administration to root and branch long-run fiscal reform, an attempt to put the United States on a sound fiscal footing. But I see no sign of it at all. The idea that we make $100 million worth of savings, or whatever ridiculous number the president came up with the other day, testifies to the fundamental unseriousness that is the problem in Washington today.
Let's allow Paul and others to respond.
Boy. Oh dear.
Oh dear, indeed.
Let's talk national income accounting off stage, okay? You forgot about retained earnings. By definition, savings in the economy as a whole are equal to investment.
In the world economy.
Our trade deficit is falling, not rising. The very fact that we have a depressed economy despite these deficits tells you that the supply of savings from the private sector is in fact, the desired supply of savings from the private sector is in fact greater than the amount that the federal government is borrowing. If that were not true, we would be seeing, in fact, an excess in demand, and that's not happening. I do worry. They're very different things. There's a question of, is there more demand? Is the amount of borrowing that everybody collectively, businesses and the government together, greater than the amount that essentially the rest of the economy is willing to lend, which is not a problem. Because, just to go back, the essence of this kind of recession is precisely that the amount that collectively we want to save is greater than the amount that collectively we want to invest. That is the problem. You can't get around that. There's a very different question, which is the long-run solvency, and I do worry about that. I worry the numbers. I would disagree very much with you about those numbers, but there is a fact. We are currently at about debt of about 60% of GDP. We have in the past been as high as 100% of GDP at the end of World War II without having a crisis, but your ability to go that high does depend upon people's belief that you will behave responsibly. And that is somewhat in question. Less so, I hope, now that we've had some regime change in this country than it was in the past. but it is a problem. So there are certainly limits, and that is one of the concerns. But I think we do need to get these things straight, because one of the things that is a problem is intellectual confusion. Unfortunately, while there are many, many real obstacles to dealing with this crisis, it is not easy to deal with. One of the really terrifying things for me has been the extent to which just sheer misunderstanding of issues that were settled 70 years ago has been crippling a lot of the policy debate, and we do need to get these things straight. Can I switch to the longer term just for a moment?
Can I come back to you on the longer term? Because Nouriel wants to talk about this issue quickly, and then I think we'll get to that.
Yes, I think the debate is a bit about what needs to be done in the short term versus the long term. I think the lesson of the Great Depression is pretty clear. The Great Depression started the stock market crash, and it became Great Depression by 1933 because of 4 reasons. One, we didn't believe in countercyclical monetary policy. The money supply contracted rather than being eased. Interest rates were not falling. That made the credit crunch worse. 2, nobody believed in countercyclical fiscal policy. The general theory of Keynes was written only in 1936. Therefore, they were raising taxes and cutting spending to maintain a balanced budget. That made the recession even more severe. 3, there was this belief in creative distraction, let the banks collapse. Thousands of them collapsed. The credit crunch became even worse. And 4, 75% of households that the mortgage defaulted by 1933 on their mortgage, they couldn't pay it. So a stock market crash became a Great Depression. Then you had currency wars, then you had trade wars, then you had protectionism, then you had capital controls, then you had default by countries, that you had rise of nasty authoritarian regimes in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in Spain, and then we ended up in World War II, right? So those are the consequences of not taking the right policy actions. And the right policy actions mean in the short run that you do the right stimulus. Now, I agree, however, that we have to worry about the long run. If we're going to finance this budget deficit by printing money, we might have high inflation or hyperinflation. That's what happened in Germany in the 30s and the Weimar Republic and so on. If we are having large budget deficits and increase in the public debt, we don't know whether it's going to be 5 trillion or 10 trillion, whatever. Eventually, there are only few ways of resolving a debt problem. Either you default on it, like countries like Argentina do, we have never done it, or use the inflation tax to wipe out the real value of the debt, or you have to raise taxes and cut government spending, and given the size of the deficits, over time, that's going to be a painful political choice. So we need the stimulus in the short run. We need to have the basis for a medium-term fiscal sustainability and drain the liquidity. Otherwise, we're going to have problems over the medium term.
Bill, do you...
I think that if you look at the president's budget, there is, if you look at it carefully, a potential answer to the dilemma you pose. And that is, he's proposed $634 billion for health care. That won't get there. That's not going to get there. So that means he's going to have to do something on Medicare and Medicaid, which are very large entitlements. And I could see him with the promise of covering most Americans, how many, 95, 96%, saying we can't get there. Now we have to do some things on Medicare and Medicaid. And when he does those things on Medicare and Medicaid, it shows that the growth of those programs, which are driving entitlements, is much less steep. It's easy to deal with Social Security. And then you've sent a message to the world economy that you are a responsible fiscal government. And then you might get money from China, Japan, other countries, even though the Chinese now, if you have, they used to finance 50% of our deficit, essentially. And now it's like at 11%. And when it goes to 1.8 trillion, it's going to be less than 11%. Foreigners are going to have less than 11, which brings us back to Paul's point, which is we don't really need the foreigners because we have increased our savings, meaning that savings can go into treasuries and therefore finance the budget deficit. But if savings go into treasuries, those savings aren't going into investing in companies that produce jobs and growth. So it creates a dilemma, but I believe that if you took a look at the budget deficit, or the budget, you see the beginning of an answer and an awareness on the part of the administration that this is an issue that has to be addressed.
George, do you think there's a big inflation awaiting us out there, big rise in